Hi everyone, this is Sam with Wine News in 5. Before I get to global news, some site news. On May 20th, we announced that our guest judge for this year's wine writing competition is Hugh Johnson, OBE. Hugh is the world's best-selling wine writer. He's responsible for Hugh Johnson's Pocket Wine Book, and he created the World Atlas of Wine in 1971. He was the sole author of the World Atlas for 4 editions before he asked Jancis to join him as co-author for the 5th edition, which was published in 2001. As updates for the 9th edition are currently underway, it feels especially fitting to have him as our guest judge. In terms of global news, today we'll discuss severe storms in Madiran, Bordeaux, Languedoc, Irouléguy, Savoie, and Navarre, a surge in Australian wine exports, a hit to the fine wine market, and a brief update on 2024 Bordeaux en Primeur. Starting with severe storms and hail all over France. May has not been a good month for French wine growers. As I mentioned 2 weeks ago, on May 3rd, hailstorms affected between 500 and 1,000 hectares in Champagne. And then on May 3rd and 4th, Madiran was hit with golf ball sized hailstones that affected 300 hectares, which is around 23% of the appellation. 100 of those hectares were completely stripped of green growth and are not expected to yield grapes this vintage. On May 10th, Bordeaux saw hail that caused damage starting around Languedoc and continuing south of Grave, impacting production in the generic appellations of Bordeaux and in Entre-deux-Mers. In certain areas, damage reached 100%. Affected producers are angry as this area hosts anti-hail generators for which they pay €1.50 per hectare, regardless of whether or not those generators are used, and which can deploy silver iodine nuclei to break up hailstones, thereby lessening the potential for damage. The intervention threshold for using these generators was raised from 30% likelihood of hail to 40% likelihood of hail as of March 31st of this year because of insufficient funding for Adelpha 33, which is the organization responsible for deployment. This storm on the 10th was forecast at 35% likelihood, which falls just under threshold. Maxime Barou, head of Chateau Eau Garriga, told Vitisphere that the generators have not been deployed any of the 5 times that the region suffered hail damage since 2019. On May 20th, Vitisphere reported that Dominique Fedu, president of Adelpha 33, would temporarily lower the activation threshold to 30%. On May 11th, Roussillon and the Languedoc experienced rain and hailstorms that caused minor damage in the Côte de Roussillon village appellation. And then eastern Languedoc was hit by intense rains and some hail fell in Fougères. 2 days later, hail hit vineyards on the west coast of France near Irouléguy and near the eastern border of the country between Bougie and Savoie. And then, on May 19th, hail caused 60 to 70% damage to 700 hectares west of Limoux. On May 12th, heavy rains fell in the Var region, affecting the Côte de Provence appellation. 8 days later, on May 20th, while soils were still saturated, certain areas of Provence received 230 millimeters of rain within an hour, which damaged infrastructure and submerged vineyards. Damage is still being assessed, but appears to be very localized and is concentrated around Lavandou, Cavalier, and Vidobon. On to a surge in Australian wine exports. Wine Australia's recent export report, which was released at the end of April, details a 41% increase in exports from March 2024 to March 2025, resulting in a total export value of 2.64 billion Australian dollars. This growth can be attributed to a rebound in exports to mainland China. The hefty tariffs that China had imposed on Australian wine in 2020, which reached highs of 218%, were lifted in March 2024. In the most recent export report, China accounted for 39% of Australian wine export value, up from next to nothing. Exports to the rest of the world were the lowest in a decade, declining 13% in value and 9% in volume. Next, a hit to the fine wine market. In April, LiveX's Fine Wine 100, which monitors the prices that the 100 most sought-after wines available on the secondary market trade at, reported a 30.2% decline in trading month on month, the most significant decline since August of 2023. The decline has been attributed to the uncertainty surrounding tariffs and to the fact that many members of the trade were occupied with en primeur tastings during the month of April. And speaking of en primeur, a brief update on 2024 Bordeaux. As I've mentioned for the last few weeks, you can find coverage of 2024 EP release prices and the relative value they might offer in our forum. In terms of major announcements that happened this past week, Coste Esternel, Aubryon, Figeac, Léoville-Poifer, Léoville-Lacasse, and Pavie have all announced EP prices that are significantly lower than 2023 EP prices. A few of these are so attractive that I'm considering buying a few bottles EP for the first time in my career. Anyway, that's all for this episode of the Wine News. If you enjoy this newscast and you'd like to see it continue, please subscribe to jancesrobinson.com. And if you have breaking news in your area, please email news@jancesrobinson.com. Thanks.